Welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. This morning we engage in a long tradition at King going back to about 1960, that of the faculty lecture. Every year, rising seniors select 2 members of King's faculty to do a lecture from this podium. Sometimes those have been about research, sometimes they've been more personal, sometimes they've been about an avocation, but each of those has given us insight into the ways that one of our own faculty members thinks and works. This morning's lecture is Dr. Chuan Ong. I'm going to let Josh Rudd introduce him in a moment. I will tell you that on the 24th is our next event. We have Michael Lamb from Wake Forest University. Michael administers the Educating Character Initiative grant, which we are a recipient of, and he's also a leading scholar in the area of Christianity and public life. So he'll be here on the 24th. If you haven't gotten a brochure yet, please do be sure you get one of those to know what the rest of the events are coming up. So please welcome Josh Rudd.
Dr. Han Ong received his bachelor's degree in biology from Wabash College. He then went to receive a PhD in molecular biology and genetics from Indiana University, studying the evolution of plant mitochondrial genes and genomes. While at Indiana, he met his wife, Dr. Laura Ong, and they now both work together in King University's biology department. Han and Laura have 3 sons. Noah is a freshman at the University of Tennessee, and Moses and Joseph are with us today supporting their father. They're sitting over there. Give them a round of applause because they are out for cultural day from school. Han's hobbies include classical singing. You've probably heard him sing in chapel. Cooking, and since the pandemic, he's really taken a liking to cycling. And he's participated in several charitable rides and things like that, so it's always fun to go riding with him. I've known Han for about 11 years, and there are 3 things that I would quickly like to share about him. The first thing is that Han has a wealth of knowledge that he genuinely wants to share. From his youth in Malaysia to present, his life experiences are a continuum that have imparted him with great wisdom. His skill at teaching may have even been inherited, as his father is also an accomplished teacher. I know that I have benefited from Han's knowledge and experience, and this is something that he offers to share with you as well. Second, Han loves adventure. It makes sense that a man who would leave his home after high school and move halfway around the world wouldn't shy away from any opportunity to experience something new. From getting me into and quickly out of my first street fight in Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown, to a bona fide ghost town in West Virginia, to a pharaoh's burial chamber in Egypt, Han has joyfully encouraged me to take advantage of life experiences and travel with him. He also offers the same opportunity to you by leading university trips abroad and domestic. Finally, Han is a faithful friend. Through my own personal struggles at times, Han has been patient and kind, while still offering an honest outside perspective to whatever the situation may be. The Message interprets Proverbs 18:24 this way: friends come and friends go, but a true friend sticks by you like family. Being around Han, Laura, and their boys is like being with family, and I believe this sentiment would be echoed by many of his former students. As you spend time here at King, do not forget to take the opportunity to get to know your faculty, like the Ongs, because you never know who will be the brother or sister that you never knew you had. So Han.
Thank you. What a joy and privilege to be with you all here today. Thank you for your presence. I'd like to thank Josh for that generous introduction. I always say one of the best things about working at King, besides having the interaction with the students, and students, you know that I love you. It's kind of awkward. I'm making eye contact with Izzy Clark over there, so that's kind of weird. Besides the students, I get to work with really remarkable faculty members, people that I have fun with, people I hang out with. And I always usually find that I can get a conversation started if I show this picture. Here's Josh Rudd behind me, and we're climbing into the bowels of the Bent Pyramid somewhere in the desert of Egypt. Dr. Brian Alderman was with us on this thing, and so he took this picture. So we get ourselves into good trouble, we get ourselves into good adventure, and so I really thank him for that generous introduction today. I'm slightly embarrassed to say that this is not my first time delivering the faculty lecture for the King Institute of Faith and Culture. The first time I gave this lecture was in the fall of 2014. However, the night before that lecture, I received a troubling phone call from then our chaplain, Dr. Alderman, who is still a chaplain here with us today, regarding the director of the institute then, which was called the Beekner Institute rather than Institute of Faith and Culture. And he informed me, Dr. Alderman informed me that Dr. Brown was in a terrible car accident. He was badly hurt. So he would succumb to his injuries about a week later. But I delivered that lecture under a pall that has befallen campus, and it was a difficult day for every one of us here on campus because Dr. Brown was dearly beloved by all of us. And so that was my experience with the first faculty lecture. The second lecture, I was slated to give that in March of 2020. We were supposed to come back from spring break, and I was to deliver that faculty lecture on the Monday following spring break. And so I hold the distinction of being the first King University event that was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I hold that title. So in a way of thinking about this is that this lecture, which I was supposed to deliver 5 years ago, is now 5 years in the making. So you get a 5-year-old speech that I was to deliver in 2020 that I'm going to deliver it to you today. So given that opportunity, I really would like to say a few things about this one particular academic hero of mine. This is Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould is no longer with us, but he was a giant in the field that I received my PhD in, which is evolutionary biology. And Stephen Jay Gould, by all accounts, was a remarkable scholar, remarkable man, prolific writer, and a very, very gracious person towards the end of his life. He was a little bit more cantankerous during the early parts of his life. I got to know the writings and the work of Stephen Jay Gould much later in life. I was actually in graduate school when my then girlfriend, now wife, Laura, bought me a book. Just out of nowhere, she decided this might be a book that I would be interested in, and that set me off on a wonderful journey of discovering Stephen Jay Gould and his writing. So this book that was given to me has the name of The Lying Stone of Marrakesh, and it's all about this underground industry of people making fake fossils. Fossils that you're using to dupe people so that they'll pay thousands, if not millions of dollars to purchase, or museums to purchase them, and then eventually they will find out that it's just a complete bogus piece of art, right? If you can call it that. And so it's so prevalent in the field of paleontology that they actually have a name for it. The Germans would call it the Laufenstein, or the lying stones. And so this entire book is about this underground industry, which is really quite a good investigative story, a lot of cultural history, a lot of scientific history. So I recommend this highly, and I was really gripped when I read this book about the lying stones of Marrakesh. And so from that piece of work, I started to explore a lot more about Stephen Jay Gould and about his writings. He was a Jewish boy who grew up in the Bronx. He went to Harvard University, participated in a lot of protests during the civil rights movement, started writing for a magazine article, and eventually that blossomed and ballooned into books and scientific articles and so on and so forth. So a very, very respected person in the field of paleontology and evolutionary biology. His only blemish, though, is that he was a lifelong fan of the New York Yankees. So that's something I could not consolidate, but I kind of gloss over that just to look at his scientific accomplishments. One major accomplishment, I think, to give you a taste of who Stephen Jay Gould was that his treatment of this person here in this picture. This person, of course, lived centuries before Stephen Jay Gould. This is the Archbishop James Usher, and this is Usher the bishop, not the singer Usher. His Usher is with double S. And this was the one that sort of sealed it for me when I read what Stephen Jay Gould tried to write about this man. Now, imagine, Stephen Jay Gould is a teacher in evolutionary biology, and as a teacher in evolutionary biology, I can tell you that there are a lot of baggages when you are teaching a class in evolutionary biology. You try to overcome some of those Western traditions that have been ingrained in some of the students prior to them coming to your class and taking your class. And I'm sure Stephen Jay Gould encountered a lot of this. One of those traditions involves understanding that life on Earth, or Earth itself, is actually very, very young. And that tradition, like it or not, traced its way all the way back to the work of James Ussher, who thought that if he could take the Bible and use it sort of as a chronological account of life on Earth, he's able to do some fuzzy math and some extrapolation and be able to extrapolate time backwards to a point where it intersects the axis that tells you the date, the actual date itself of when Earth was created. And by his calculation, he dates it all the way back to October 23rd. I don't know how he did that, but he did. All the way to October 23rd, 4004 BC, which would make Earth today right around 6,000 years old, right? So this tradition that we don't know where it comes from, a lot of us in various quarters would try to take this as the absolute truth, that Earth is indeed very, very young and around 6,000 years old. So imagine Stephen Jay Gould himself, a teacher like me, would try to dispel this, to try to overcome this tradition, this baggage that his students will bring into his class, and try to tell them that life really indeed is not that young. Life is actually quite old. Life is very, very old. In fact, in the degree of billions of years old, right? So why would Stephen Jay Gould himself be gracious and try to salvage some of the reputation that's sort of eroded over time with the scientific community of Bishop James Ussher? And so this is the glimpse, because Stephen Jay Gould, much later in life, was very gracious, was very soft, kind of fuzzy character over here later in life. And he wrote this about James Ussher, supposedly, I guess, his academic nemesis, because he's trying to teach his students about an old Earth, and yet he has to counter the tradition of a very young Earth, a very young life on Earth. So he said, "I shall be defending Ussher's chronology as an honorable effort for its time, and arguing that our usual ridicule only records a lamentable small-mindedness based on mistaken use of present criteria to judge a distant and different past." That whole notion of using present criteria and judging past will come into play later on. Ussher represents the best of scholarship in his time. He was part of a substantial research tradition, a large community of intellectuals working toward a common goal under an accepted methodology. So short of you thinking that this was how Stephen Jay Gould was all his life, that would be completely wrong. This is a more mellowed Stephen Jay Gould later in life. Because when he was young, this is the picture when he was in middle age and onwards, when he was young, this is how Stephen Jay Gould looked like. And he was part of a group that was known as the sort of enfant terrible of evolutionary biology. They were there to sort of muck things up, to stir the hornet's nest, to try to get the establishment to rethink how we consider the theory of evolution, right? He subscribed to the theory of evolution by natural selection by Charles Darwin, but he said that's not all there is to understand. There's something more. We should not acquiesce so easily to the master every time we think about evolutionary biology. So in some ways, trying to buck the trend and trying to be young, I guess, to get the establishment to think in ways that are different than the traditional sense of thinking. So in 1979, just 2 years after I was born, Gould collaborated with this person here who eventually became a giant in the field of evolutionary biology as well, Richard Lewontin, and they published this paper. And this is a paper that I really like to assign to my upper level students when I have the opportunity to do that. Last semester, Brooklyn Quark and Mason Sanders and I got to do this as part of our independent study course, and we did a deep dive into this paper. The title of the paper is "The Spandrel of San Marcos and the Panglossian Paradigm, a Critique of the Adaptationist Program." Completely bombastic title, super out there, right? I like it for many reasons. One of them is that in order to understand this paper, to read this paper, you have to understand a few things, right? You have to understand what the heck a spandrel is. Then you have to understand what the heck a Panglossian paradigm is. And then you have to understand what the heck an adaptationist program is, right? So you have architecture, you have literature, which is part of Voltaire's Candide about the Panglossian paradigm. And then finally, you need to know something about biology. So for students in a liberal arts institution, this is exciting stuff because your training should eventually lead you to be able to read this paper and understand it. Okay? So let's unpack this a little bit, not too much. This is actually quite a long paper, but let's talk about the first part, and that's the only part that I want to focus on today, which is the Spandrels of San Marco. And San Marco, of course, is the Italian word for St. Mark. And what he was referring to was St. Mark's Cathedral, St. Mark's Church over in Venice. And this is a picture of the interior of St. Mark. Okay? So St. Mark's Church has 5 domes. This is quite weird because typically in a cathedral or a big church, you have 1, at most 2, but this one has 5 domes, and that's what's special about this church. Now, in order to build a dome, it's easier said than done. You do not want your dome to look heavy. You want your dome to look really, really light. You want it to be soaring. You want it to feel as if it's really lightweight. And the whole aspect of building the dome is really to draw your attention, to draw your gaze upwards. And so whatever decor and decoration messages that you have under the dome really is to compel you to look towards heaven, right? I mean, this is sort of an architectural device just to focus you somewhere as soon as you walk into a church. Now, most of you, and myself included, when we first talk about building domes and stuff, we don't know the architectural techniques that goes into building a dome. So imagine with me, if you will, if we are going to build a dome today, okay? The dome itself is heavy. It's a heavy architectural design. And for that heavy dome to sit on something, it really has to sit on something that gives it really, really strong support. And the Romans figured this out, that for you to suspend a dome as if it's kind of lightweight and ethereal up there, you really have to build arches. And the way you suspend a dome upwards is that you build arches as if in a square. So you build an arch on this way, on this plane, an arch here, an arch there, and an arch there. So if you box it all in with 4 arches, those 4 arches will give you the required support for you to actually sit a dome right above it. Okay? So if you do that, then you are going to create a situation like this. So imagine if the circle suspending above is the opening to the dome, underneath it you have these arches. And as you build these arches, inevitably you are also going to produce these kind of weird, odd triangular shapes that come in between those arches. Those are spandrels. The architectural term for this sort of byproduct of you building arches are called spandrels. So no one sets out to build spandrels. No one cares about building spandrels. You get spandrels in the process of building arches. And then later on, after you've built this correctly, you can suspend a dome right above it. Now, spandrels is actually quite a good literary device, and Gould and Lewontin were the first to start to use this as a metaphor to things that you try to explain in evolutionary biology. Okay? Spandrels are, if you want to think about it, a dongle. They are a byproduct, they're sort of offshoot of you trying to build arches, and it becomes problematic. A lot of times it becomes very problematic for interior designers of churches, right? So if you look at spandrels over here, this spandrel here is being decorated with angels, and angels are typically common motifs that you put into spandrels. Artistically, it's quite difficult for you to do that. How do you paint a landscape? How do you paint stories in this kind of weird triangular space? So a lot of times you find artists have problems, and churches do have problems trying to decorate this kind of triangular space of a spandrel, right? It's there, it's annoying, you have to deal with it. Sometimes they just don't deal with it at all and ignore the existence of a spandrel completely. So if you look at spandrels, artists have tried to do many different things with spandrels over the years. This is part of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel itself is not a dome, but it's a vaulted ceiling. So under all those arches on the sides of the Sistine Chapel, you will find that there are plenty of spandrels created just because you built those arches in. And so those spandrels are typically kind of filled with very generic things, right? A siren, a person at a well, somebody just kind of staring out into the abyss. Whatever it is, it's just something there just to fill the space. If you are creative enough, or if you have a sense of humor, you can go to a villa in Italy whereby the spandrel here contained a lot of allegorical representation, and here is the allegory of death blowing bubbles, right? however you want to interpret that. So there are some whimsical considerations when you want to decorate this kind of dead space, this kind of space that you don't know much of what to do with it. Closer to home, there is a spandrel that you can look at if you go to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and this would be under the rotunda, the dome of the Natural History Museum. As you can see, the architects have dedicated a lot of decorations, a lot of care into the marble columns, into the granite faces. But by the time it gets to the spandrel themselves, right? By the time it gets to the spandrel themselves, let's just paint it gray because we really don't know what to do with that. Rather than being triangular spandrel, because the arches are actually unequal size, there are two big ones and one small one, it creates an even weirder sort of quadrilateral space that we really don't know what to do with it. So this is the kind of architectural design, architectural offshoot, byproduct, that Stephen Jay Gould seized upon and used that to illustrate some concepts in evolutionary biology. Okay? So he wrote in the Spandrel of San Marco several things, right? And I'll just kind of briefly rattle through them. He actually mentioned that we have become too complacent. Remember, this is part of the enfant terrible, people who try to stir the hornet's nest in the field of evolutionary biology. And he claimed, in this paper with Richard Lewontin, that we have become too complacent with the way that we view science. Rather than interpreting data properly, we almost too often revert to common sense and say, yeah, that just kind of makes sense. That's how it would be. And that would be a very unkosher way to do science. You have already a conclusion in mind, and you try to get all those data to fit and explain that conclusion, which is really, really terrible science. The other thing that he mentioned in this was that scientists are no longer comfortable sitting with the unknown and sitting with the mystery of things. We almost always clumsily try to explain something via science, so much so that if we don't have the technology or the know-how to interpret the science, we're not good at saying, let's let it be. Maybe in 10, 20 years, we'll come back and we revisit this. With that future knowledge, we might be able to make sense out of something. But we don't do that. We almost kind of hurriedly try to find something that fits really oddly and try to explain something based on present knowledge. And so that's one of his critique. The final critique, even though he himself was brought up in the tradition of Darwinian evolution, that theory of binatural selection, he was saying that we are always over-relying on that, as if it is the end-all, be-all. We're trying to interpret everything that we see in nature as if it is adaptive. This is adaptive, that is adaptive, and not taking a chance to step back and say, well, this really isn't that adaptive if you think really hard about it. So what are the alternate interpretations of something that continues to persist in your community, in your population, when it's not adaptive? It kind of blew people's mind for a while that there are actually alternate explanations to certain things, that it does not always have to be falling under the explanation of natural selection. So he decided that there was some ways of interpreting things, and one of the ways that he could do that is to use the concept of spandrels, right? And so the one poster child of explaining spandrelic, that's not my word, that's Stephen Jay Gould's word, a spandrelic adaptation, and the poster child of his is this. You guys know what this is, right? This is a modern interpretation, a modern rendition of something that should be familiar to every single boy growing up over the last 30, 40 years. This is your Tyrannosaurus Rex, your T-Rex, right? And this is a modern rendition because this one has feathers painted into it. So only in the last 25, 30 years do we understand that these creatures actually do have feathers because they were the ancestors of modern-day birds, okay? So when you look at a T-Rex, many things jump out at you, right? The ferociousness of this organism, the sharp teeth, the very, very strong hind legs, the cantilevered tail behind it. But then what jumps out at you? Yeah, everyone likes to do this, right? Because we have many little memes of dinosaurs having to do push-ups or scratch your back. T-Rexes can't scratch their backs because they have these tiny little legs. Those are not their arms. Those are legs, right? Remember, they are dinosaurids, which means they don't really have arms, they have legs, but these legs are completely reduced, comically so. And so for the 1950s all the way to 1970s, paleontologists, people that Stephen Jay Gould would have been very familiar with, try to clumsily explain the adaptiveness of having tiny little arms. And sometimes those explanations can be really laughable today if you read them, and some of them actually quite scandalous, right? If you don't know what I mean, go ahead and read that paper. It's scandalous to think how you could explain a T-Rex having those tiny little things. And Stephen Jay Gould said, you are approaching this completely wrong. Those tiny little legs are not adaptive by any means. Those are just dongles. Those are just byproducts of other things within the T-Rex that is actually adaptive. In order to become a ferocious predator, in order for you to run fast, for you to pivot, right, on a dime, you really have to develop this kind of counterbalance with that big tail. You have to have really powerful hind legs. And in the process of prioritizing all these other things for them to be adapted to make you a ferocious predator, something's got to give, right? These things that no longer give you any sort of advantage, anything that's adaptive, starts to reduce in its function and start to become insignificant. So in other words, those tiny little front legs are in fact biological spandrels, if you think about the illustration and how he uses spandrels. Okay, they're just dongles, they're just byproducts of things. So when I was developing this in 2020, it was funny, right? Because when you talk about memes out about T-Rexes, I like memes about T-Rexes, but at the start of the pandemic in March 2020, we were all told not to touch our faces, and that's not a problem for a T-Rex, clearly. So Stephen Jay Gould and Lewontin sort of branched off and do his own thing, but Stephen Jay Gould, 20 years later, sort of published a follow-up piece, and this was almost a piece where he's patting himself on the back, right? Breaking his arm, patting himself on the back, to, in fact, praise himself for this wonderful device of a biological spandrel. Using spandrel as a literary device, using it as a metaphor, was in fact quite useful, because later on you can pick on a lot of different things out there in nature that are not easily, on the face value, adaptive, but you can explain it via a spandrel, another way of explaining something that is a byproduct. So he coined this new term. So rather than something being adaptive, he called it exaptive. Okay, so here's the exaptive excellence of a spandrel. And exaptive or exaptation, by his definition, is actually this. Something that is not really selected naturally, it hasn't undergone the traditional process of natural selection, or it might have. But whatever it is, it has now been co-opted for a different function. So using adaptation or the theory of natural selection to explain certain things might actually not be accurate, might actually be quite clumsy, because whatever it was adapted for has been lost in time, and whatever you see now as a snapshot is in fact a different function that it was not originally adapted for. So this idea of exaptation to describe certain things in nature, why do we have these things? Because we don't see any reason why these features will allow you to grow older or have more children, right? This whole idea of survival of the fittest so that you can pass your genes on. Those things all don't fit very well, right? And one of the examples he gave was the human chin, right? The chin really doesn't do anything. It is really not adaptive. We don't burrow with our chin. Maybe you do, I don't. We don't use our chin for many things, and so why do we continue to have chins? Why do humans continue to have chins? Somewhat sacrilegious, I know Pat is here, but he also used the example of music. Music really doesn't help you as much to grow old, doesn't really help you to have more children, right? Unless you're listening to Marvin Gaye. You're not going to have more children listening to music. But it persists. It spreads through our population. It is in fact quite important. Music is quite important. A lot of us would say music is very important. But through the lens of adaptation, what does it do to make our lives better? What does it do to make us fitter for our environment? It doesn't. Okay? So under that harsh definition, Stephen Jay Gould said, we just have to put that aside and consider music and the human chin and a host of other things as being exaptive rather than it being adaptive. Okay? So I'm going to do something now that I tell my students not to do whenever I advise them about giving a presentation, which is to not do an awkward transition. I'm going to do an awkward transition. So, bees. If you consider bees, they are not exactly easy to explain. Well, you can explain the anatomy of bees, you can explain the biology of bees, but it's very difficult for you to explain the behavior of bees. Because in the world of evolutionary biology or organismal biology, bees are known as being perfectly eusocial, which means every single bee has a role in the hive, but not every single bee gets to propagate the next generation. If you are a worker bee, if you are a defender bee, if you're a soldier bee, your job is really to care for the hive. You have to defend the hive, you have to bring food to the hive, bring pollen to it, and only a few individuals, if not just one individual, will get to mate with the queen bee. And the queen bee here is easily labeled for you with a sticker number 15. That's the queen bee. So how do you explain this via the lens of natural selection? Because natural selection tells you about the survival of the fittest. The better you get access to the female, the more children you have, that's really what is preferred in your development. But bees just don't do that. In fact, what bees do is what we know as, today, the act of altruism, where you are doing something for the benefit of the entire colony. You're not doing something for the benefit of yourself. In fact, a stricter definition of altruism is that when you extend altruism to a recipient, the recipient benefits a lot from your act of altruism, but in fact, the strict definition is you have to suffer a loss. You have to suffer some kind of loss, whether it is your resources, your time, something that otherwise would benefit you, you are giving that away. So an analogy is that if you give someone $5 for lunch, right, that's good, that's a good gesture, but that would not be altruistic unless it caused you to not have lunch because you have given away the only $5 you have. So this kind of behavior is just really difficult if you try to explain it through the traditional sense of adaptation. Why would this sort of behavior be adaptive? And scientists have given a lot of thought to this, right? And we are very good at altruism when it involves our own kind. You are likely to be more altruistic to the people who are related to you by blood, right? Being altruistic to my kids, being altruistic to somebody I love, like my wife, that's easy. We can all do that. But why are we sometimes altruistic to people we barely even know? Or the way to think about it, why should we be altruistic to people we barely even know? Why do we do good things in our lives for people who are not related to us? And if you think about the great philanthropists, you think about the great givers, the great donors, that really befuddles the evolutionary biologists trying to rationalize this sort of behavior. Okay? You guys might know Dr. Jerry Swamsidi. He has a project about digging wells in rural Nigeria so that people in rural Nigeria will be able to get access to fresh water. And when he announced this to our church, I mean, the money came pouring in quickly and abundantly, and hardly anyone in our church knew anybody personally all the way in rural Nigeria, yet they gave, yet they did that. So this is quite odd for us to think about altruism, but my friends in the humanities and in the other branches of sciences can explain altruism probably much better than from the standpoint of a biologist, right? Dr. DeFord might tell you that this is all under the opposite of egoism, right? The Freudian understanding that we're all built to be egotistical. We have this super ego. We care about ourselves. And that would be very consistent with evolutionary biology. You care for the preservation of self so that you can grow old, so you can have more kids, so genetically you are able to pass on yourself to the next generation. But altruism is the opposite of that. And in philosophy, you have this concept about otherism. When is it that you have this mental capacity to not just continue to think about me, just think about yourselves, but to start to think about others? And this is a very weird way to look at it if you think about that yourself a little bit, that we try to project care not just for the preservation of self, for the survival of the fittest, but we are now thinking about others. How do we think about the hive? How do we do better for the entire colony by the things that we do? Okay? So we try to come up with different kinds of definitions, and this will be a very simplistic figure of thinking about the possible ways that you can react to different situations, right? This is very simplistic, but on the top of the chart, you have the actor. So if you are the one enacting this behavior, you are the actor, and whoever gets the result of your acts will be the beneficiary or will be the recipients. So the first two behavior on the left-hand column are really easy to do, right? Cooperative behavior is easy. We all know because we benefit from cooperative behavior. If I'm cooperative with someone, that person benefits, but I get something back as well. So that's really easy for us to do. Unfortunately, selfish behavior is also quite easy. It's easy because this is what we are programmed to do, right? I get the benefit while the recipient is actually harmed or actually suffers a little bit of harm. So how do you illustrate selfishness? It's very easy. You don't even have to explain this picture. You can see the act of selfishness on display. If you have a basketball in a gym where you have spent several minutes with that basketball and your little brother wants to have a few seconds or at least some play with that basketball and you yank it away from his grasp, that is clearly selfish. And we are all programmed to do that. I've heard people say this is the kid's sin nature, right? It is their sin nature to behave that way. And that is actually quite accurate in describing how we are all programmed to be. We have this sin nature. We have this selfishness built into us, okay? Another one that is really a little bit easy for us to do is also being spiteful. And this is a phenomenon where we do something not to hurt other people, but in the process we hurt ourselves as well, and yet we are willing to do that, right? A lot of political discourse is that way. You just kind of burn everything. It's not a scorched earth sort of policy that even I lose, I don't care because I get to own you. I get to show you who's boss, even though that just kind of destroys this community that we are all supposed to be part of. Altruistic behavior is difficult. It's very, very difficult. It's actually a spandrel because it's not directly adaptive behavior for us. In order to be altruistic, we have to reprogram ourselves. We have to force ourselves to be altruistic, okay? There are many athletes in this room, so I'm going to give you an athletic analogy here, right? I love sports. You all know that. Let me rephrase. I love to watch all sports, all right? And you know that. And one sport that I really, really love is cycling. Not only am I a cyclist, I love to watch the sport of cycling as well. And the argument that I would like to make is that in cycling, you see the ultimate sacrifice. You see the ultimate act of altruism. Because every member of a 9-member cycling team will not get to win the Tour de France. One member out of the 9 will win the Tour de France. And so you decide among your 9, or the team director will decide which one is actually the team leader. That's the one who is going to win the Tour de France. The rest of you, the 7 or 8 of you, are going to serve as servants to that one winner or that one potential winner. In fact, the French have a word for these people. They are called domestiques, which means you are the domestic help. You are the servants, and your role in the team over the 21 days is to serve the leader. When the leader wins, the leader wins. They never say, oh, this team won. No, he won the entire Tour de France. And so as a domestique, you extend yourself, you exhaust yourself because you're not going to win the race. You are just there as a servant. So you fall back to your team car, you get a bunch of water bottles and stuff yourself heavy. Imagine trying to climb a mountain and you have 7, 8 bottles on your shirt. You sometimes go back and get a banana, get a little gel. And at the end of the day, your leader has crossed the line and you come in maybe about hours later, sometimes 2 to 3 hours later, you cross the line because you're so exhausted you can barely make it up the mountain. But you do all this in service of your leader. This is really sacrificial service. This is really altruism at its best, okay? I like this picture the most because this is Mark Cavendish, who retired recently. And in this picture, Mark Cavendish, those of you who know cycling will recognize the UCI World Champions jersey. So when you have those colorful stripes, it indicates that you are the world champion that year. So for the whole year, you get to wear a jersey that's completely different than your teammates. It makes you stand out for the cameras. And this is particularly poignant because here you have the world champion, right? Mark Cavendish is the world champion in this race, and he's serving as a domestique. He's serving to bring water bottles to his leader way up front, falling back, expanding all his energy in service of one person in his team, okay? So the sport dictates that you have to behave this way. Otherwise, no one will win. No one in the team will win if no one wants to serve as a domestique. So these cyclists almost have to reprogram themselves every time thinking, if I'm going into the race, this is not my race. I'm in this race to serve, and that's the extent of it, okay? So again, bringing it back, for all these things that are spandrelic in our lives, it's difficult to think about it because we are all definitely programmed to be selfish. We are all programmed to care for self, and many different things have been written about this aspect of our human nature. The one beautiful thing about thinking of altruistic behavior is that we are thinking about this and learning about this and getting exposed to this in a Christian campus setting. And that's very easy for us to talk about these things in our everyday lives. I'll give you an example. Every year before we take the freshmen to DC, we'll have an orientation meeting that Dr. Peltier will run. And as per tradition, as we tell students about how to navigate Washington, DC, how to use the metro, Dr. Alderman, as the chaplain, will come up and he will actually give a primer as to how we are going to treat the homeless population that we are definitely going to encounter when we are in Washington, D.C. And the gist of the message really is, if you feel that you can give, or if you want to give, then give. But if you don't want to, or you don't have the means to give, then there are certain types of behavior we expect you to represent if you are representing King University as a Christian university. And this kind of primer really harkens back, right, to all this aspect of giving grace even when it is deserving or not deserving. We're just giving grace to everyone around us. That's exactly what Christ has asked us to do, and that's exactly what we're doing here in this institution. So it's quite important for us to not think about ourselves, think about ego. Oh my gosh, is this person going to harm me? Is this person going to steal my money? But usually when you encounter a homeless person, you have to think about this aspect of otherism, of thinking about something beyond your own self-preservation. And that's the kind of primer, I think, that Dr. Alderman gives us every single year before we send the freshmen out into the city. Chase gave a nice talk on Wednesday about Mr. Rogers as this whole parable of the Good Samaritan. And so there are some places where we can look and to be inspired by how people give of themselves as sacrificial service to others. Mr. Rogers himself is famous with this quote that in times of crisis, you guys know this quote, right? In times of crisis, you look to the helper, right? Search for the helper, and those are the kinds of people that you should emulate. Don't look for the ones that are all about preserving ourselves. We must protect ourselves first and care for ourselves, and everybody else that's secondary or not tertiary. You look for the helpers, because those are the ones that will give you that guiding star on how you should behave in times of crisis. And so Mr. Rogers really is that kind of character in his ministry via TV, addressing very difficult issues during the civil rights era, and trying to tell us about life is really not about yourself. You should really reprogram yourself to start thinking about the others. And who personified it better than Mother Teresa, or who is now Saint Teresa of Calcutta, of giving herself her entire life, moving away from her home in Europe and living amongst the squalor of Calcutta and giving of herself for the rest of her life. So these are the ones, right, beyond the influencers and the celebrities, these are the people that we should look to as examples on how we think about otherism or think about something beyond ourselves. When I was about to give this lecture in 2020, one of our alumnus, Alan Clark, was featured in the news. And Alan is still around. I sung with him in men's ensemble several times. And in this news piece, it tells of Alan Clark actually giving away his car to somebody who was actually in greater need of that car than he himself. And so Alan, for a few months, as he saved up for another car, walked and biked to work and came to school walking or biking, and was able to perform this ultimate act of sacrifice, of altruism, by giving his car to somebody else who would benefit from using that car and driving to her job. And so that's remarkable. That's really something that we should really, really look to. I want to wrap this up because the whole point of talking about Spandrel here is just an opportunity for me to talk about the story of my grandmother. This is my maternal grandmother. Her name is Sim Ju, and the kid with her with the world's largest head, that's me. My grandmother was really the epitome of sacrificial service. Since her husband's death all the way to her own death, a span of about 8 years, she dedicated herself in full service to a temple near our house. She was Buddhist for all her life. And she would go to the temple, she would cook for the monks who lived there, she would cook for the poor because it itself also was a soup kitchen. And after all the cooking, she would stay and tidy up the entire compound, sweep leaves, polish brass, refill oils on candles and stuff. And while she was babysitting me before I started school, I was actually a partner with her, and we would go to the temple all day long, and we would eat with the monks, and all vegetarian food. And she would put me to tiny little tasks that a tiny little boy might be able to accomplish, right? Picking out dead leaves from a pot, or rearranging cushions and stuff like that. So I was really privileged. I was really privileged since the early part of my life to have that guiding star, to have that person to look to understand what it is about giving of oneself, about thinking of others, of otherism, other than just self-preservation. So, why do we do this? Why should we do this? We should because, after all, we belong to the one who gave it all, right? Even his begotten Son, so that we might have eternal life. So if you really don't have an earthly guiding star thinking about this, you have a heavenly guiding star thinking about what you should do to be spandrels to others. It is good to be altruistic. It is good to be spandrels to all those around you. Thank you.
Thank you, Han. I think Han practices what he preaches in his life, and I think we're all grateful that he's here, part of this campus community. And I hope that you guys have someone who is altruistic in your life, and I hope you guys take opportunities to be altruistic to others. So welcome Han up. We're going to give him this plaque to commemorate this. For the eternity of this plaque, we'll all remember this talk. So. And we're all dismissed.